I'm titling this talk, The State We're In. North Carolina is a state of 9.7 million people, according to the Census Bureau. And even during the recession, we've continued to grow at about the rate of 15% per year, or about 100,000 people. 72% of us are white, 22% black, 8% Hispanic, and that group is the fastest growing population in our state. Now some 800,000, with about another 300,000 undocumented Hispanics. 51.3% of us are female, 24% are under the age of 18, 13% are over 65, and that group is growing rapidly with the aging of the baby boomers and the influx of retirees. How you view North Carolina is largely dependent on what part of the state you live in. Folks along the I-85 corridor from Raleigh to Charlotte will tell you things are getting better. Folks east of I-95 will report things are bad and getting desperate. And folks in Western Carolina are going to say things hadn't changed a whole lot, they've always been bad. If you had to choose one word to describe the year 2013, it would be reform. The election of a Republican governor, coupled with a veto-proof Republican majority in both houses, and their stated intent to get things done, has raised expectations for this year. If we're honest about it, North Carolina has been more or less coasting without firm leadership and direction for the past 15 years. We've been reactive rather than proactive. We went from being a state that met issues head-on to a state that nibbled around the edges of problems, either unwilling or unable to propose and enact bold solutions. Now, deferred action usually results in crisis, and in crisis is when we've acted. That's no way to run a state. If you believe in the public opinion polls of our state, most North Carolinians think we're headed in the wrong direction. 15 years ago, I started NC Spin. I was worried that we were going to run out of topics after the first 6 months, but the biggest problem I've really had has been trying to choose which topics warrant airtime on the show. We've got 28 minutes and 26 seconds each week, a bunch of panelists that love to talk, and I often feel like the guy in the ancient days of the Colosseum that went into the center of the Colosseum and threw the raw meat on the floor and then ran like hell to try to get out of the way of the lions. We're at a fork in the road in our state. And to paraphrase that great philosopher Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. It's time for us to chart a new course, develop a plan for our future, and get to work. So let's look at the state we're in and talk about some solutions. They are chosen not necessarily in order of importance or urgency, but of topicality and by continuity to subject matter. I'll start with Medicaid, since that seems to be the topic we've thought about most the last few days. We've known for years that our Medicaid program was a mess, and we didn't need Beth Wood's audit to tell us that this program has suffered from mismanagement, cost overruns, insufficient oversight, waste, fraud, and structural problems. But until now, we've not had a governor or a legislature that was willing to seriously tackle this program that cost us $13 billion a year, of which $3 billion comes from our state. It accounts for 22% of our state budget, and even with all of its problems, it has helped many of the 1.5 million North Carolinians who receive benefits each year. Perhaps the tipping point came when Wood's audit pointed out we're spending $180 million more in administrative cost than the average of 9 other states. Governor McCrory seems to be making Medicaid reform a high priority, and DHS Secretary Aldona Wash understands the complexity of the problem and has hired Medicaid Director Carol Steckel, who ran the Medicaid program in Alabama and Louisiana, and we have high hopes that they can make some positive changes. If you compare our Medicaid programs with other states, you'll see that ours provides more benefits than perhaps we can afford. Reform is not only desirable, it's urgent. It won't be easy, but it is essential to our future. What makes Medicaid reform even more urgent is the implementation of the new Affordable Care Act, which a lot of people like to call Obamacare. The ACA dictates that every person in America be covered by health care insurance, and each state is mandated to establish one or more health insurance exchanges. There are three options. One, we can design and manage our own state plan. Two, we can work with a state-federal partnership. Or three, we can let the feds run it. We had a lot of discussion about this in the legislature last year, and the House passed a plan for a state-run exchange in time for last summer's deadline decision. But the Senate didn't even take up the bill, and the House had passed, essentially deferring the decision to Governor Perdue, who chose the state-federal option. Now the Senate says they don't want anything to do with exchanges, and in the first full week of session has passed legislation to let the federal government establish and run ours. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this pretty interesting that here's a bunch of people who rail all the time about the federal government and its controls, and yet they're willing to turn over our health insurance exchange program to the feds. They also don't want to expand Medicaid to a projected 500,000 new recipients in our state. The feds promised 100% funding for the first 3 years and 90% thereafter, and our senators are rightfully skeptical about these potential unfunded future mandates. We talk about that on our show this week, and our panel has agreed that the most troubling part of Senate Bill 4 and the discussion that went on with it is the apparent power play that the Senate leaders pulled over Governor McCrory, essentially telling him to butt out. These are legislative decisions, they said, not to be made by a governor. Folks, Medicaid is important. This program involves many dollars and many people, and we need the best and brightest minds we've got in North Carolina to make sure we get this right, regardless of their party, regardless of their elected position. This is no time for petty power plays. So let's look at health care. Our state ranks 33rd in the nation in health care indicators. We're 5th in obesity. 66% of our adults, 28% of our children are overweight or obese. Nearly 1 in 3 adults has high blood pressure. 1 in 10 has diabetes. And 4 in 10 report high cholesterol. 17% of the families in our state report that they have food insecurity, and we're 10th in the nation for children under 18 who worry about having enough to eat. 1.5 million people in North Carolina don't have health insurance, and for many of them, the first option for health care is the emergency department, which is the most expensive and one of the most profitable departments in the hospital. These symptoms reflect a health care system that frankly is a train wreck. Most of the major players in the health care field will give voice to wanting to fix this system, but few are really willing to come to the table and do anything about it. There are too many dollars and too much turf at stake. So cost gets shifted to those with health insurance, i.e. employers and employees, and taxpayers who have to pay for Medicaid and Medicare. We spend too much money and get health outcomes that don't compare with what we're spending. Patients and consumers need educating as to what healthy looks like, what their personal roles should be in health care, how they can better access health care, and how they can bring down the cost of health care through better eating and exercise behaviors. Now, to toot our own horns for just a second, NC SPIN is getting ready to launch a statewide health care initiative called A Healthier NC, which mirrors a similar initiative that our state undertook back in the 1940s called the Good Health Plan. Look for more to come from this later. The way we treat our mentally ill is nothing short of criminal. and should be a painful reminder to us about bungled reform. Back in 2001, we decided to reform our mental health system. We closed or completely changed services provided by our mental health hospitals, saying we wanted to push those services to the local level instead of providing them at the state level. Problem was, the locals were neither equipped to or desirous of providing this responsibility. So we put the mentally ill on the streets, where many landed in jails or became homeless, or we stuck them in adult care homes, not adequately staffed to provide for them. Services were now provided by outside contractors, some of whom cheated and gouged the system. We remember about $400 million worth of overcharging not too many years ago. We can and must do better by these folks who are unable to do for themselves. Folks, this is the safety net that we promised in our social contract. The economy and jobs. Well, the number one theme last year in the elections was the economy and jobs. North Carolina lost more than 300,000 jobs during the Great Recession, many of them in manufacturing. Now, if you couple those jobs lost with the in-migration of 100,000 people each year, you can see why we've got a 9.2% unemployment rate. It's the fifth highest in the nation, and it's been that way for about 3 years. Factor in the number who've given up work, looking for work, or who are underemployed, people who are working today for less money than they previously earned, and our true rate of unemployment and underemployment in North Carolina is probably more like 18 or 19%. Per capita income is $25,256 in our state compared to the national average of $28,000. And that is higher along the I-85 corridor, as you might expect, and much lower in the rural sections of our state. Almost 1 in 5, or 16% of the people in North Carolina, live below the federal poverty level of $23,050 for a family of 4. Everybody wants to talk about job creation. Realistically, there's very little being done about it. Just cutting government spending or cutting taxes isn't going to create jobs, at least in the short run. We haven't had an economic development plan in this state in such a long time, most of us can't even remember when we did. It may not be the government's responsibility to create jobs, but government has to have a role in this, especially when you connect that to our growing crisis in infrastructure. Public infrastructure is, in fact, at crisis levels. The American Society for Civil Engineers gives our state a grade of D for infrastructure. And if population increasingly dependent on the internet, excuse me, I've skipped this page here. All right, if projections are close to accurate, we're going to have 12 million or more people here by 2030. We're staring down the barrel at a major crisis. Much of our infrastructure in this state was built 30 to 50 years ago. Governor McCrory said he was appalled at the poor level of maintenance in current state-owned buildings, but the same can be said for roads and bridges. Almost a third of our bridges are considered substandard. We once called ourselves the good road state, but that hasn't been true in more than 20 years. We can't maintain the current roads we have, much less build ones for today or tomorrow. The Highway Trust Fund we created back in the late 1980s was supposed to fund future roads, but it hadn't come close because it depends largely on the gasoline tax. And while our gasoline tax is among the highest in the Southeast, people are now driving more fuel-efficient cars, and with the growth even with the growth in traffic, we still fall further behind every year. It's clear we've got to find some new funding sources for roads. And I don't know whether that means more toll roads or the vehicle miles traveled or VMT tax, but there's got to be some better way than what we've got now. Then there's water. With all this growth, we're facing clean water shortages. 70% of our water systems in North Carolina are municipally owned, and many of them were put in operation 40 years ago. We've got the highest number of small water systems of any state in the nation. 138 of the 214 water systems in towns of 2,500 or less are losing money and are unable to even maintain their systems, which poses future health hazards. We haven't started any new water reservoirs in this state for over 30 years, which, by the way, is about the length of time it takes to bring one online. The cost to repair and expand our water systems is projected to be better than $17 billion. And this doesn't even include a discussion of water treatment facilities, which also need a lot of work. You may have seen the recent report that the Federal Communications Commission just released that says that we are tied with Mississippi for having the lowest number of households with basic broadband connections. While business, government, and consumers are increasingly dependent on the internet for commerce, education, and information, we are at the bottom of the broadband pipeline, and this does not bode well for our future. Then there's public schools. Our need for public schools buildings is acute and growing daily, as is the need for other public buildings, but few of our local officials are willing to put forward bond campaigns and go into debt because of that dreaded T word, taxes. They're afraid if they raise taxes, they're going to get thrown out of office by the voters. Folks, if my former boss, the late Harlan Boyle, State Treasurer of North Carolina, was still around today, he would be telling anyone who would listen that now is the time for our state to engage in a major public infrastructure building program. Here's why. We've got historically low interest rates, and governments with AAA credit ratings like ours can borrow money as cheaply as any of us can remember in our history. We currently owe about $7.1 billion in debt, but even that is we're considered a low debt state by the credit rating agencies. Construction costs are still very reasonable, and we could put tens of thousands of people to work. We've heard it estimated that for every $1 billion in new construction we invest, we'll create 28,000 new jobs through the ripple effect and direct employment. That will move the needle on unemployment in North Carolina. If properly designed and executed, this program would bring down our unemployment rate while updating our public infrastructure, and we pay with it with greater government efficiency, and with the growth those 28,000 jobs will help generate to the state. I got to talk about tax reform. With all the conversation that's going on about tax reform, I've got to say that our current codes were basically put in place when Max Gardner was governor of North Carolina back during the Great Depression. Since that time, we have layered on exclusions, tax preferences, exemptions, and exceptions. Our economy has shifted from one of textiles, tobacco, and furniture manufacturing to information, biotechnology, agriculture, and tourism. We badly need tax reform, but let me just say that just reducing income taxes on individuals and corporations isn't reform. It's just another way of tweaking the tax codes, which are already cumbersome, difficult to understand, and hard to use. We've had enough blue ribbon panels on this to last a lifetime, and most of them have come up with the same conclusions. And I don't understand why we aren't willing to dust off those studies and consider them when we talk about tax reform. For real tax reform to occur in North Carolina, there are several things that need to happen. First, we need to give some serious thought to the various tax categories and what percentage our revenues should come from each category. For instance, we currently receive 50% of our roughly $20 billion a year in state revenues from personal income taxes. 4% comes from corporate taxes. 27% is obtained by sales and use taxes. Are they configured in the right percentages? If not, let's decide what the right ratios ought to be first. And while at the task, let's also look at the revenue sources for our local governments and determine what taxes should be right for them. Any new tax reform needs to be simple to understand and efficient to enforce. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The idea of taxing services sounds really sexy, but how difficult is it going to be to collect taxes from the guy who cuts your yard or repairs your washing machine? Really small service providers. How hard is it going to be for the state to collect those taxes? Tax reform must be transparent, with no hidden exclusions and preferences given one group over another. It's got to be fair to all segments of the population, and it needs to be broad-based with the lowest rates possible. And finally, tax reform has got to be futuristic. We have got to try to look ahead to determine where our economy is going and where revenues potentially could come from, so we don't get stuck in a time warp like we're in right now. Well, we can't discuss the state we're in without talking about education, where most of us agree reforms are in fact needed. We expend 56% of our general fund budget on education. K-12 education gets 38%, the UNC system gets 13%, and our community colleges just 5%. We got really excited last year when we learned that 80% of the students who started the 9th grade graduated within 4 years, which admittedly was an improvement from the 67% it had been just a few years before. Our annual SAT scores are 997 compared to the average of 1,010. 84% of our people have at least a high school diploma, but only 26.5% have a college or postgraduate degree. And upwards of 60% of our high school graduates require remediation when they go either to community colleges or to four-year schools. Now, there's a lot of good going on in a lot of classrooms in North Carolina, and I don't want to say that there's not. But there are too many ineffective teachers and too many ineffective principals. We need to reform education, and sadly, our educators are not leading that reform. If our children are going to compete, we've got to put a laptop or a tablet in the hands of every one of them. When textbooks cost as much as $300 a piece, we can employ curriculum software that allows every child to learn at his or her own pace for far less money. Teachers need to be retrained to become mentors, coaches, curriculum enrichment professionals, instead of standing in front of a classroom all day long lecturing. And there are online assessment tools available so that students can be measured every few weeks, and we can find out how well they're absorbing this information. There are school systems in our state that are already doing this, and we can replicate it statewide. We just have to do it. Governor McCrory is also correct in saying we've put too much emphasis on the need to have a college education, as witnessed by the fact that only 26.5% of us do. We've got to help our students learn skills they can use in the workforce. Our university system also needs reform, and we're glad to see President Tom Ross encouraging and embracing it. Only 59% of those who enter the universities graduate within 5 years. In spite of the fact that our public universities are among the lowest in tuition cost in the nation, the average person is graduating with a debt of $25,000 to begin their work life. There's strong evidence we're not utilizing classroom space well. There are too many electives that keep students from being able to graduate on time because they can't get the courses they need because they're not being offered. And universities have not been accountable enough to us in North Carolina. Recent revelations at UNC Chapel Hill demonstrate conclusively that we cannot just abdicate curriculum and course study to faculty. I think Ross and the Board of Governors have gotten the message that they need to be better stewards with the dollars that they receive, and funding needs to be allocated based on graduation within a reasonable period and specific goals like training more teachers. I mentioned community colleges last because I believe they're the greatest bargain in education in our state. We could ease some of the enrollment problems at our universities by encouraging our young people to spend the first year or so at their local community college. They would gain some maturity, earn some money to save for matriculation, and could get a feel for what's required in college coursework. Our 58 community colleges are also the best places to train or retrain workers. So rather than reinvent the wheel, we hope the discussions about renewed vocational training in high school will be coordinated with our community colleges. Just a couple of words on the political climate. Democrats ruled our state with few exceptions for more than 100 years, but the voters grew dissatisfied with the increased cost of government coupled with lackluster leadership and threw them out of power. For the past 2 years, we've seen a Democratic governor and Republican-controlled legislature cross-legged with each other. When we elected Pat McCrory to be governor, most of us hoped that would bring about harmony. His track record as a moderate mayor was very appealing to a lot of us. Expect to see a continued move to accountability in all sectors of government. We may not have the wholesale budget cuts that we've experienced, and we certainly hope we never again see the inefficient across-the-board cuts. But if we're going to improve technology, repair and rebuild our infrastructure, and conduct the reforms we've been talking about, there's going to have to be more funding. And since there are not going to be any new tax rates, the money's going to have to come from improved efficiency within government. I'm already seeing signs that all is not happy between the legislature and the executive branches. There's always some tension between these two houses of the legislature and the governor, and also between the two houses of the legislature themselves. But for us to solve our problems, we need to get along. If there's one thing I've learned in 15 years of producing and moderating NC Spin is that we can't find solutions when people are not willing to come together to have open, honest, civil discussion about our issues. If we're more interested in our political party or its agenda, if we're more determined to win so that someone else loses, if we're unwilling to listen to other viewpoints, we'll become just like our Congress. And that spells disaster for a state with the problems we've got. We've got to demand that our leaders be open to more than just their own personal political agendas. We've got great needs, and we've been beaten up quite a bit as a state over the last few years, but we're a great and resilient people who can and will rise to the occasion when properly motivated. It's time for our leaders to prove themselves worthy of our great citizens, to be willing to make the hard choices for the common good and invest in our resources where they'll get the biggest bang for the buck for the most of us. We can't get there if we choose up sides and fight with each other. We won't get there if we shy away from the challenges or give in to the lobbyists and special interests. We have elected some good people, and we really believe they want to do what's right. We hope they will. Our job is to keep them on the right course.